What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. My credentials are on your screen right now, and I want to talk about some stuff around champion balance because I like thinking about League of Legends, I like talking about League of Legends, and I like sharing my thought process with other people and being social in that way. So let's talk about two large, important factors in champion balance, and they are champion mastery and champion agency. So what is this presentation? Why is it here? Welcome to the channel. This is basically a snapshot about how I'm thinking about champion balance right now. This will inevitably change over time. There are lots of inputs into what's important, what makes a champion properly tuned, and for now, I think these are probably the two front runners, and so this is what I'm leading with to talk about, like, hey, these are probably the two most important factors to think about when thinking about how a champion should be tuned. The reason I think this video can be helpful is that it can help other players sort of understand like what can make a champion balanced or imbalanced. Generally speaking, I've seen, at least in English speaking communities, that these sorts of videos have generally done a pretty good job of informing players on some other thought processes, and it seems to have had some level of impact in the discourse around the game. So that's encouraging, and I want to keep doing that for that reason. There can be some misconceptions around champion balance or what is mastery or what is agency. So I want to kind of update people on my thinking. This is not necessarily authoritative, but I think they are pretty workable and useful definitions here. And part of this is it is a semi-scripted video in that there's just a bunch of sort of bullet points on the screen. I'll try to stick to them, and I will probably not ramble as much. We'll see if we can get this video in 20 minutes or less. It'd be nice. And again, it's just kind of fun to think about this kind of stuff. I was thinking about this quite a bit over the weekend, and I decided I want to make a video, and so I did. Okay, so why do champion balance at all? And I want to sort of express that I'm using balance as a verb here. We are retuning things. Actual theoretical perfect objective balance is not strictly an end goal here, but it is a very good tool in making a competitive game like League of Legends very fun. Live service games, especially competitive live service games like League of Legends, are it's really valuable for them to have constant live balance updates. It is less valuable for a single player story driven game. Even if these games may have balance issues, it doesn't matter if the best class in Skyrim is Stealth Archer, because Skyrim is fun and balance is not why you play a very good game like Skyrim. Balance is really important in making a game like League of Legends feel competitive and rewarding of your time. And so obviously different strokes for different games. League is one where balance is a very effective tool to make sure all the other important things around League of Legends are valued and upheld by the game as well. Of course, to me, the king here is that gameplay is fun, just kind of outright, that it is fun to play League of Legends. A game being imbalanced can hurt that. And of course, everyone's fun matters. If you're playing a game on Seven's Rift, if there's 10 players there, your fun matters, the 5 opponents' fun matters, and your 4 teammates' fun matters. And so, kind of laddering into that, where kind of the fun of every player is what's important, your champion needs to be able to have interesting choices to make, and you have to be able to play out the game in a fun way, which means if your champion is critically weak, you're going to have a really hard time having your choices matter at all. And you're going to have a really hard time enjoying the game because you're constantly being killed. Okay, underpowered champions are bad for that reason. Sure. Your opponents deserve to get to interact in meaningful ways with your champion. They need to have some level of counterplay. They need to have some way to be able to beat you. And so a champion with too many tools can feel like your opponents never get a say in what they can do. Some champions may have too much counterplay, meaning that you can't express your skill level, or have too little counterplay, aka your opponents can't express their skill, and that can be frustrating at either end. And so getting the correct balance there is important. And of course, your teammates should also not feel griefed by your champ. Of course, they're not interacting with your agency very much. They're not interacting with the quality of your counterplay very much. They're not always interacting with your level of champ mastery, but they are interacting with what is this champion's outputs. Are they losing LP because you picked this? And that can always really hurt people as well. This third one tends to be somewhat the least important of the three. My experience has been that players are on average relatively accepting of like moderately acceptable champion picks. Like even if Cassante has a 48% win rate in Grandmaster, made up numbers, I don't know what it is right now at this moment. So technically, if you're playing Grandmaster solo queue and you're top of the Cassante, technically they've dropped your win rate by 2%. I have never seen someone complain that somebody picked a hard champion with a fairly low win rate. That's at least been my experience playing relatively high elo in North America, but generally speaking, this one seems to not be a huge issue unless a champion is critically weak, in which case people are going to feel slighted by people picking a believed to be bad champion. So that's kind of like, I would say, a really good broad stroke of why to do champion balance at all. Let's move forward. So, part one of this framework is champion mastery. Basically, to sum it up, it's how hard it is to know both what you should be doing and how to actually do it correctly. Those are both important. There's the brain skills in terms of like what I actually should be doing, and then also the brain slot, like the hand-eye coordination of how to actually make that thing happen. Now, some of these skills are transferable, so you could have a very high tempo, very like supposedly high mastery AD carry, but if you've played AD carries for 10 years, you understand how to right click people and kite between auto attacks and everything else. And so it's just often not that difficult. There's a lot of champions where you might believe they're difficult, but ultimately just playing League for 15 years in some cases just means you've learned all the skills anyway. It doesn't really matter anymore. That's a pretty big deal, actually. And so this can actually change really drastically if a game is brand new versus a game has been out for a while, or a genre is brand new or has been out for a while. There's plenty of games where someone will come in and be like, oh, I played this game on a hard mode and it was really, really easy. Well, it's like, well, yes, you've played a bunch of tactical games in your life, so you understand intuitively all of the game systems around turn-based combat and action points and manipulating initiative order and all these things. And if you're a first-time player of a genre like this, none of these make sense to you, and so you're going to simply blunder in and make poor choices. League of Legends was the first really, really, really popular MOBA as far as I can tell, where it just kind of became like a number one game. And so a lot of people came into playing League of Legends having never played a MOBA before. Of course, some of us came from Defense of the Ancients or something else, but in my case, I'd played Dota for 8 six five yeah, around their years, since Reign of Chaos, Warcraft 3. And so I knew a bunch of stuff, and I went to the top of the ladder really early on back in 2009 when no one else knew how to play MOBAs for the most part, and people I was competing with competed in Dota back then, right? And then as time went on, a lot of players just came from World of Warcraft or Fortnite or whatever as time goes on further, and this all changes, right? And also, the game's been more mature. It's just, there's a lot of things that can change what this means. But having transferable skills does a lot for what your game actually looks like and how hard things actually are if it's similar. Day one of Valorant, people coming from Counter-Strike or Battlefield or any other shooter are going to already do 90% of Valorant really, really well, which is click on heads. Those skills are transferable, right? Even if the game itself is very hard, some players can transfer the skills right in. So that can be a really long topic. I'm already spending a long time rambling on transferable skills, but there's a lot going on there. Anyway, the next point I want to talk about, though, is that in terms of targeting individual champion mastery, the ballpark right now, that's in my head, is around 300 games of experience. Now, this is a very, very rough average. A lot goes into this. Technically, if you play Yasuo on ARAM, you are getting reps on Yasuo, at least in terms of understanding what his skills do, what his interactions look like, some degree of how your damage plays out, understanding that you can ult off of your Malphite teammate, right? But of course, are you learning laning phase? Not at all. Are you learning map rotations? Not at all. Are you learning your power curves? Not really. You're not going to play F5 at level 3 and most times playing Yasuo. But some of the skills are transferable. Some of it matters. And so you can kind of count ARAM games at partial value for learning Yasuo. There is some learning that is done automatically by doing so. This is all fairly relevant. If you're a Zyra support player and you start playing Zyra jungle, there's going to be some things that are cleanly transferable, like your ability combos and a decent understanding of how you scale and a decent understanding of how to play team fights. But there's a lot of other things, such as how you play Zyra in the context of jungling. When can you invade? When can you be invaded? How to use the fact that you have a fast clear? These, again, some are transferable, some are not, but this ends up being a very inexact science because slicing everything down in a way that you could mathematically prove is the correct way, exactly what fraction of a game is it when you play Yasuo and ARAM versus SR? And what fraction of a game of Yasuo mid is worth it when you're playing Yasuo bot lane? Good luck. It's per champion. Why do this? But really, really broad strokes, saying about 300 games of experience, kind of all encompassing, ends up lining up with intuition of what players actually believe. If we tune a champion and we say, yes, every single champion of the game from Malphite to Yasuo, at 300 games vaguely aggregate of experience playing, they're going to have fairly similar win rates. Using that as the way to then target champion win rates ends up matching player intuition quite well overall. And so this is not an authoritative number in terms of I went into the mines and figured it out, but it's this ends up matching up, looking at mastery data and win rate data and player sentiment, that this is pretty accurate. And so it's a pretty good way to say, hey, around here is roughly how champions are equal. And so the reason to do this, by the way, again, is to match player intuition. This is really valuable. players feeling like champions are fair, that when they learn to the game, not only do they have a chance at performing well if they know their champion, but also things like, hey, I'm brand new. Okay, here's some easy champions to play. This is kind of playing for champions for every player. And basically to say that, yeah, if you are going to really, really dedicatedly main a very difficult champion like Cassante or Azir or Lee Sin or Yasuo or Riven, which has, who all have like extremely long mastery curves and extremely long mastery tails, you can be rewarded for doing so. It is worth it to one-trick Yasuo for 1,000 games, and if you do so, you will be rewarded. The inflection point for Yasuo is short of perfect mastery. Meanwhile, if you like playing lots of different things, or you don't have a lot of time to play, great. There are a lot of champions that are really, really good for your first 10 games, and in many cases for your first 100 games. They'll be better than many other champions for your first, several dozen games or whatever, and hey, not every champion is for every player. If you're someone who can only play 15 games a month and you like to play the next hottest thing, you're going to want to try to play the easy champions, the ones that don't require a lot of mastery. Maybe they're ones who have a lot of transferable skills because they're similar to other champions you already play. Or you're like, no, I really want a one trick and try to climb a challenge with it. Okay, well, you should play something that's very, very deep that's going to reward you with more and more performance by playing 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 games as a champion. And this means that you're just going to have these varying experiences. And that's just going to be something that you have to accept as a player, that if you like champion A and they don't reward that much depth, you've got to either understand that you can't get that much more out of it, or you've got to find other ways to optimize, or you either move or you understand it. And again, this roughly matches player intuition for the kinds of win rates you see that make sense and the players seem to go along with it. Okay, so let's talk about some intuitively high mastery champions. Again, either it is hard, either they have few transferable skills, and so you have to relearn them from the ground up. I think Azir is a really good example of this. Azir's spell paradigms are very different from almost every other mid laner and every other champ in the game. The mechanical requirements and the awareness requirements are very difficult as well. Are they near your sand soldiers? Will right-clicking them run you towards normal attack range, or will it let your sand soldier attack them? Understanding your WEQ combos into backwards R shuffles, that's not only a skill test of reading the overall game state, which to be fair is a transferable skill, but also understanding how fast your champ can do this. Are you safe to do so? Will this be enough damage to kill based on your champion and some of your your teammates? That part's transferable, of course, but Azir is a very hard champion. Azir, I think at current tuning, is the tied for second worst champion to play if it's your very first game on them. Nunu is here as well, by the way. Nunu's not written here, but Nunu is also very difficult to play. Cassante, of course, in this mode as well, right? Cassante has some unique spell paradigms. Cassante is actually a pretty high skill and high agency tank, and so it's important that you actually understand your timing windows, because he's tuned around actually you having the agency to win games by yourself in some cases. Keep in mind his R can grief you, it shreds your own resists, and it cuts your max health in about half, which means this is one of the few champions you can press a spell that actively kills you. This will dock you a lot of win rate if you do not have the mastery to understand when you are allowed to do this as Cassante. When your R will get over the wall and separate your opponent. When your R will not do that and you're going to just kill yourself. When it's okay to simply R just for the insec and the knockback because your teammate is there, and understanding that, again, a transferable skill, but understanding when it's worth it to cast R there without dying. Understanding that W is an aggressive parry. That's not a very difficult skill, but it is still there. Understanding that W is an aggressive parry. Understanding your E has several different cast ranges and several different cast speeds. E into Q combos, how to use Q3. There's a lot of stuff here. There's a lot of spell combos. There's a lot to learn about Cassante. Katarina, right? A lot of combat awareness, a lot of knowing your own champion's limits. Any resetter tends to be like this a little bit. Some of that because they have very high agency, but it does mean that you need to be able to learn your champion's ins and outs very well, because otherwise you're going to lose out on a lot of opportunity that your champion is kind of tuned around. Riven, very similar boat, a lot of agency for what you want to do, but also she has very difficult to access spell combos. You have to right-click the ground during some of your button presses in order to get your attacks out sooner, which is a fairly esoteric mechanic that actually a lot of champions have, but Riven is the most obvious of them since Q is a full attack reset and she's already in melee range, but that one's there. Rek'Sai has a bunch of unique gameplay around learning how to use her tunnels, around her ult having a non-standard cast time. For a very long time, Rek'Sai had no late game, so it really, really rewarded you having extremely high knowledge of good early ganking. Now, that is a transferable skill, being good at early ganking, yes, but Rek'Sai has unique gank access due to her tunnels and how long that range of the dash is, when it's worth you flashing for the knockup, when it's not, and all these things here. Ducking out and the fairly recent Rek'Sai update played up the ability to understand when to duck out, read and come back in, playing actively with your tunnels in combat itself, but also made some of the other points a little bit less important because just straightforward dashing was actually made stronger, and so even if you didn't understand tunnels all that well, but you understood maybe disengaging, you just had a straightforward dash that was relatively easy to use and made Rex have slightly more transferable skills. And so, hey, here are some examples of high mastery champions with explanations for why they would be obviously high mastery champions. Here are some unintuitive high mastery champions. Singed. There was nothing mechanically hard about Singed whatsoever, except that Singed does not play like any other champion in the game. So if you want to learn how to lane with Singed or teamfight with Singed, there are not a lot of other champions who lane like Singed. Even other juggernauts who are low mobility, no dashes, purely melee. You think about Garen and Darius and Ilaoi. These are all juggernauts. Singed is kind of a juggernaut, but he doesn't like stack on his front line and then assassinate or whatever like a Darius would, where he gets 5 attacks and starts going for R chains, or Garen, where he's looking for the execute, but he can just sit there for line and hit, and he's got like a timing test on his W, and that's kind of it there. Singed, you have to learn how to lane on exactly Singed, because he has no laning phase, which means learn how to proxy. That is not a hugely transferable skill. Not a lot of top laners proxy. Udyr has unique outputs. Which spell do you clone because of your ultimate? He has a non-standard ultimate, so do I QQ, do I WW, do I EE, do I RR? There are situations for each of these, and someone who learns Udyr more will do better and better at this. Udyr, again, is another champion where, because you have to be in melee range to do just about anything, understanding through the context of Udyr what is a fight I'm allowed to take, because I don't have a fallback pattern of, well, at least I can just throw poke out from far back. And even if this was a fight where I could have all in, didn't think about it, let's say you're Syndra, well, Syndra can at least just like, well, max range Q, max range QE, throw out an R, whatever, and hey, you're probably 1/2 to 3/4 effective, even if you really misread your champion's context in the fight. You're still doing things. If you misread Udyr's context in a fight, you instantly die or do literally nothing. When you could have not died or been useful or done something else. And so the fact that there's kind of no fallback pattern means you have to really, really learn exactly Udyr's context in every fight. Ivern, incredibly non-standard, right? You have to learn Ivern jungle pathing specifically. Also, you tend to be a jungler, and many junglers don't know how to play enchanters. They don't understand the playstyle. They also may not understand controlling a pet with Daisy here. There's a lot of unique skill tests for Ivern that have to be learned that are non-transferable and Ivern specific. Even though the mechanics of Ivern's kit are very, very easy, the brain check of Ivern is entirely unique. You've got to learn a whole bunch of Ivern unique things. Shaco is fairly similar to Ivern in this regard, where, again, the buttons themselves are intuitive and straightforward. There's a very mild parry on the R that's not very hard. Controlling a clone is a little bit difficult in some cases, but his jungle clearing is very different. His gank act is very different. The type of things he can do very different. Setting up box camps, especially if you're playing AP Shaco, that skill level is entirely different. And so, right, here are some champions where if there are, basically the whole point of this is, if there are not a lot of mains, or there are a lot of first timers, these are all champions where the win is going to be dragged down, because first timers will have a 42 to 45% winner on a champion, and the experts will have 43, 44, 45%, or sorry, 53, 54, 55% win rate. But if there's more 45s and 55s, this champion will look weak via win rate, but it's just hard to play. We can talk about some low mastery champions, things where almost all of the skills are transferable, or the process of learning this champion's ins and outs are very, very easy. Miss Fortune has roughly one unique mechanic in understanding how to aim the double up, and getting the feel for when double will kill the minion to deal bonus damage to secondary target. This is a skill that you learn at level 1 in most cases, has a low mana cost and a low cooldown. There is a lot of repeatability on this spell. You can learn how Misfortune Q works very, very, very easily. If you imagine that this was a spell that had a 6-minute cooldown and only came out at level 6, it would take a lot longer to learn Misfortune Q, especially if it was a large portion of her power budget. There would be a much longer mastery curve for Misfortune. But at the end of the day, you can repeatedly learn and relearn and relearn and refine how Misfortune Q works and what's going to be valuable here. Ashe, also a straightforward champion. Sure, vision control is sort of a high skill thing to play around, but straightforward skill shots with volley, straightforward skill shots with hawkshot, essentially, fairly straightforward skill shot with R. Understanding how to cross up somebody with an ultimate is an acquired skill, but also aiming skill shots is fairly intuitive. At the end of the day, it's a certain amount of guesswork, and yeah, you can you get a little bit more by learning some map awareness, but map awareness is a transferable skill. Ashe is a pretty straightforward to play champion. Malphite, very straightforward. All those buttons, very intuitive. There's an attack reset on W. Again, transferable skill here. Malphite is another champion with a very, very flat, low, easy mastery curve. We should expect to see a high win on a champion like this because everything's straightforward. Master Yi, with the exception of being melee, can be difficult, especially against highly skilled opponents and highly coordinated opponents. Master Yi has a really, really straightforward kit, especially the one from 12 years ago. Now Master Yi has some more optimizations. Hey, he has a dash where you press Q or right click a second time to pick out where you go. On a pretty tight timing window, learn where to end Master Yi Q. That is a unique skill that is fairly non-transferable, that requires pretty quick thinking, and the context of where does Master Yi want to be at the end of his Q in the context of any given fight. That adds some mastery. Meditate has really, really sharp damage reduction when you first tap it, a very low cooldown. It's an attack reset. It's a really unintuitive attack reset because you need to like get right back out of it by right-clicking. There's a lot here that actually says, here's what this ability does. And then again, he is a melee champion who's fairly squishy, and against coordinated opponents, that can be very difficult to play. So understanding the fight context for Master Yi can be fairly difficult. So Master Yi, nowadays is much more difficult than he was 12 years ago, but old Master Yi had a lot fewer of these considerations. W's cooldown was so long it didn't really matter. Q didn't have any smart tests other than, I guess, how to dodge a skill shot sometimes, but then even then, that Q would fail to dodge a lot of skill shots. And you saw the difficulties around being a melee champion. That's why Master Yi did really, really well in low elo and really, really poorly in high elo. Now he has more mastery expression and more agency, and that has been flattened out somewhat. Let's talk about some unintuitively low mastery champions. And you might be surprised by some of these, but let's talk about it. Ezreal, contrary to probably what's easy to think about, is he's actually a fairly low mastery champion. Now, again, mastery is not agency. These are not the same thing. We'll talk about agency down the line of this video, but Ezreal's gameplay is all very, very straightforward. Right-click some people, throw your skills at the opponents. Yeah, as a global, okay, sure. There's a blink, very easy. Arcane Shift is one of the most bog standard blinks in the game. There's nothing like difficult to learn on Ezreal except that like, oh yeah, W makes my E heat seeking. That's relatively easy to access. Again, there's the map awareness understanding of using your R. There's some minor optimizations around like use W on a turret to keep your passive attack speed going, which is like minor and it has some value here. Ezreal doesn't have no mastery curve, but everything on Ezreal is very straightforward, very easy to learn, and oftentimes very transferable. Now, back in 2011 or 2010, when Ezreal came out, there weren't a lot of skill shot AD carries. If you were like, yeah, I play Ashe, and most of what I do is right-click some people, and it's like, here's Ezreal. You're going to play AD carry, and it's all about skill shots. And you're like, wait a second, what? Boomerang Blade wasn't why I played Sivir, it was Ricochet. It was a toggle back then, even. That was going to be a skill set that was not as transferable. And I'm sure back when Ezreal came out, it was actually much harder to transfer the skill set, and it was much harder back in the day. But in modern day League of Legends, a lot of champions have skill shots, practically all of them, and Ezreal's skill set is very transferable. And so in modern day League of Legends, he is easy to learn as a champion. Kai'Sa is another one where her buttons are fairly easy. Now there is some around when to use her R, and I think it's actually worth playing that up as an important skill test. But all of her abilities are fairly straightforward. I have a steroid that turns me invisible, which has a lot of agency to it and has some skill testing, but it doesn't dodge skill shots. So there's nothing like extra special around the E, really. There's some build optimization. That's a big one. Every couple of patches, there is a new learning curve for Kai'Sa for figuring out what is the new best build. Right now, it's Static Shiv, Rage Blade, Nashor's Tooth to get all 3 evolves on 3 items, but that will change again in a few years or a few months or whatever, and there will be a new skill curve for Kai'Sa. But, you know, again, the champion is relatively straightforward. All her abilities are immediately able to learn and be learned, and you can kind of transfer all your AD carry skills into playing Kai'Sa. Yasuo, but not really, and Lee Sin, but not really. So Yasuo's actually first like 50 or 70 game mastery curve is relatively shallow. It looks a lot like Ezreal or Kai'Sa, Misfortune, or Malphite, because there's not actually that many difficult to learn Yasuo skills. The difficulty actually is that it takes 1,000 games or more to fully master Yasuo, because he essentially has enough agency that there is always something else to learn about why you should do a certain thing with Yasuo. Lee Sin is somewhat in a boat here as well. Kick Flash is so relatively easy to access that you don't really have to learn ward hopping that much on this champion. But essentially, these are champions where the first 100 games is not this really stark like rise in the way that you would see on a Rek'Sai or an Azir or an Ivern, where going from 0 to basic competency takes some while. The baseline for Yasuo and Lee Sin is basic competency. The skills are fairly intuitive. Reflex tests on a parry are nothing new for Yasuo. When he first came out, Windwall was more of a paradigm shift, but there's a lot of skills that are kind of like Windwall nowadays, and so understanding how to learn them is just and use them is just not that hard anymore. Yeah, Lee Sin has quite a lot of skill shots, but again, energy is on a decent half dozen champion now, so learning energy costs is not as hard anymore. There's many more transferable skills now. Double cast paradigms on Q and E and W, again, much more learnable, much more transferable now. Having ally cast abilities on an offensive character, a little bit more transferable. This is, more common in more champions nowadays, though still relatively rare. And again, they still have master curves. These champions both go to 1,000 games. It's just the game 1 to 100 is not as steep as intuitively high master champions like Azir, Cassandra, Katarina, Riven, Rek'Sai, etc., where you've got to learn the new skill for the champion. These champions don't really have that. It just have a permanent mastery curve if you can get better and better and better and better as you play. So let's move on to talk about champion agency. I think this gets conflated with champ mastery a lot, and I want to kind of separate the two. In short, it's how much control you have over the outcome of the game. This is not, did I learn my champion? This is, generally speaking, once you're moderately competent at your champion, how much control do you have over the game? And generally speaking, the game asks you to use that control. And the thing about having a lot of agency over the results is that you have the ability to misplay. Right? Zeri E is a high agency skill. You can instantly kill yourself by dashing into the team and dying. A decent portion of players will do that despite having control over not killing themselves. That is a win rate loss. You also have the ability to not kill yourself with E and dash away from almost every gank in the game. That is a lot of potential power that not all players access. So in the world of champion mastery, where champions could have deflated win rates because too many players are bad at the champion relative to the mains who are good at the champion, you can have champions whose win rates are low because their agency is very, very high, but enough players make mistakes that they're not representing that agency and turning it into wins. So it's your ability to capitalize on your own success, converting a laning phase lead or a good gank, or you got some shutdown gold, or if you're just in the driver's seat, can you capitalize and turn that into a win because you're already ahead? This means you have agency over the game. If I'm ahead, we'll win because of me. That is agency. Your ability to outplay your opponents, whether you're doing well or not. If they're coming for you and you can say, nah, I'm not going to die. I can wind wall. I can riposte. I can arcane shift. I can flash, which every champion has, sure. But the more you have these tools where you think you're trying to kill me, but I can beat this. I can parry this. I can outplay you because I'm Vayne, or I can play from so far away that you can't reach me, or whatever. Your ability to outplay means your champion has more agency. Now, the more skilled you are, the more reliably you're going to access that outplay, and the less skilled you are, the less you can reliably access that outplay. The skills all may be very, very intuitive. Vayne is another champion, for example, with a relatively shallow mastery curve for early learning, but she's also relatively high agency. She has self-peel, she has constant self-invisibility, she has a really, really high frequency dash, which means she can outplay a lot of stuff. But how good are you at League of Legends? It's not hard to understand what Vayne does. The mental skill there is not difficult. It's not about learning Vayne. It's about performing to a high level constantly, which, hey, we're humans. That's never going to happen all the time. And the next part about this is your ability to be outplayed despite a lead. How much counterplay does your champion have? The more counterplay your champion has, the less agency you have, because it's less about how well can I capitalize on my success, how well can I snowball off of my lead or my one kill or whatever, or having a good matchup even. But also, right, okay, I can outplay when they're ahead. I can outplay their assassin, their diver, their vanguard, their whatever. I can outplay their peel. I can do whatever. But, ooh, if they can outplay me, there's a cap in how much I can do because my opponents are good enough. They can still beat me. Or if my opponents, or the other side of it, it doesn't matter how good my opponents are, they can't outplay me. As long as I can learn the combo, you're instantly dead. Qiyana can sometimes have this. Qiyana has a very steep mastery curve. Qiyana can outplay opponents. Qiyana snowballs quite well and capitalizes on her own success. And Qiyana frequently cannot be outplayed because a lot of her spells can hit confirm. EQ is pretty much hard heat seeking, and you can make EQ a root, which means if they're remotely near a wall and you use the right EQ combo, they cannot prevent themselves from dying to EQ WQR into they're just perma CC'd and they've taken your entire kit. And they can't do anything if they were remotely near a wall. Their counterplay was accessed a long time ago, which is not be near a wall. Rengar is like this. Rengar has incredibly low counterplay on his actual damage. It's basically don't be there. Now, to be clear, that is accessible. Some degree of peeling is accessible. Things like the R only dealing bonus damage to the first target in range means that Braum can walk in front and you can dive over him to go hit Jinx. That is certainly a possibility, and you will have less damage, but that is the only part of the kit's damage that can be outplayed and counterplayed. And in fact, Rengar then, if he doesn't need the damage, can press double W, break out of the CC, and not be outplayed despite a lead. Right? This is all very important. This is all very relevant. This is actually part of why we use skill shots almost everywhere, because as a skill shot user, you can outplay your opponents by dodging their skill shots with a blink or being fast or just being good at the, a champ overall. A champ with, by the way, very, very low move speed has very few ways to outplay their opponents. For example, Yuumi mostly can't outplay her opponents. She doesn't control her own movement most of the time, right? And if your abilities are all skill shots, you can have a lower agency champion, which allows you to be outplayed despite a lead, which lowers your agency, but can be worthwhile and make a more compelling game overall. Also, we're past 30 minutes. I failed to be short here. And in general, much like with Champion Mastery, where we sort of ballparked around 300 games of mastery of prior experience, which roughly lined up with player intuition of appropriate power levels on champions, I think the correct way to tune with reference to agency is to tune as though players are highly proficient. Now, again, you can't mathematically graph agency nearly as easily as you can mathematically graph champion mastery. It is incredibly straightforward to mathematically derive champion mastery. It is not hard at all. Champion agency is much more difficult. You would have to have there's a lot into it. It can be done to a certain degree of accuracy and precision, but it's just much harder. But regardless, tuning as though players are highly proficient usually is what matches player expectations. So if I think about what Yasuo does, Yasuo has a lot of agency over what he does in the game. If I'm talking about Riven, Riven's early game is very high agency because she has a lot of mobility. She's one-on-one. Forcing to be in melee range is not a big deal. If someone wants to run her down, she can choose to get away. If someone wants to gank her, she can often get away. If someone wants to deal some poke damage, she can block it constantly with her E. If she wants to chase you down, she has 2 stuns and 4 dashes. She has a lot of agency in her laning phase. Now, unfortunately, because it's all melee, if her opponent is Darius, she has 0 agency. None of her tools outplay Darius. She can try to, break out of the Q sweet spot, but E hit confirms the Q sweet spot. If she's ahead, she can capitalize on her success and keep killing Darius, but the odds of that are very, very low. Her ability to outplay Darius is quite low. Her ability to be outplayed despite a lead, okay, that one actually is very, very low against almost every other top laner in the game. If she's ahead, she's going to do it. But if she's not tuned to be able to beat Darius 1v1, this agency just right here says, no, it's actually going to be low. Now, in the average matchup, Riven's agency is actually very high. In the average top lane matchup, Riven has very, very high agency. And then as we go into the late game, what happens? Well, Riven is a melee champion who has to be entirely melee to play League of Legends, and it turns out targeted crowd control is really, really good, and she's relatively squishy to play her builds out, and so, her ability to outplay is often quite low. She needs to be in 2-on-2s and 3-on-3s, or use her ability to get over walls to outplay. And again, this is accessible, but it's very hard. Her ability to be outplayed despite a lead. Now, usually it's just go ahead and group up, but hey, if that's what League of Legends is about, cool, there's going to be accessed quite a lot here. And overall, this is just an explanation that, hey, agency can be, fairly deep. And let's talk about some other forms of champion agency. So let's deep dive into things like power curves. So scaling, both in terms of gold and levels, is a way to think about agency with power curves. So Kayle has incredibly, incredibly low agency in their game. Despite the fact that she uses gold very, very well, she can't translate gold into anything in the early game. Late game, by the time she's level 16, she translates very, very well. She is a ranged, consistent DPS, low variability auto attacker. That is incredibly high agency. She now deals the most damage in the game, right? She capitalizes on her own success. She's now ahead in the game. Her ability to outplay your opponents. Are you a diver? Self-cast R. Are you melee? Lamau, I have max auto attack range and a bunch of permanent movement speed. Are you trying to outplay me? I right-click you. Where's my context? Kayle is one of the highest agency level 16 champions in the game, of course, provided she has gold, such that the right clicks actually matter. By the time we're level 16, Kayle is, in fact, one of the highest agency champs in the game late game. Pre-6, she is, I think, maybe the literally lowest agency champ in the game because her gold leads do not matter. She is functionally ill-equipped to deal with anyone in a 1v1. She has an atrocious laning phase on purpose to reach that late game scaling fantasy, and so she goes from having an incredibly low amount of agency to an incredibly high amount of agency. Riven is somewhat the opposite here, but even though Riven is a good gold scaler, she has a lot of tools to go beat someone up 1v1 in the early game. Yes, matchup pending, sure. I mean, Kayle has good matchups too. She loves fighting Shen so that he leaves lane and she gets to farm for free. Kayle, Riven has good and bad matchups as well, some of which she can't use her agency on, and that's going to make her matchup feel really, really bad. And some she can, and they can't play League of Legends because she is a high agency champion with a winning lane matchup. If she holds the entire lane, her opponent can't do anything if she's good. And then you have champions like Malphite, where the agency is fairly low at all points in time, generally speaking via the scaling motif here, where Malphite does not convert gold into that much throughput. He gets to be a bit tankier, but that doesn't matter a ton overall. It just doesn't end up mattering that much because in League of Legends, you're allowed to build percent health damage, you're allowed to build armor and magic penetration as a percentage, and so you just can't become invincible. This game says that eventually the game trends toward even tanks dying pretty quickly. That is intentional, but just it's worth calling out that that is something that's going to be true, that Malphite never really scales that hard. But he's also just always useful, and that's fine. Malphite is going to be, and that's the thing, right, is because Malphite doesn't really scale, he is low agency on a power curve sentiment, because it doesn't really matter what happens, Malphite is always Malphite. He just, once he's level 6, always has R. It doesn't matter how much gold you have, R is always the same spell. The amount of CC you get on Q, the amount of CC you get on E, doesn't matter how much gold you have, it's always going to have the same output here. And so whether you're 0 and 10 or 10 and 0, Malphite is going to have a lot of similar things here. AP Malphite a bit different. Obviously going to have some different scaling here, but generally speaking, yeah, Malphite's low. Carryability. We talked about this a little bit. It's similar with scaling, but hey, how much can you carry the game, right? Talking about power curves here, that earlier bullet point. How much can you convert your advantage into winning the game? In the early game, Kayle can't do it. In the early game, Riven really can. In the late game, Kayle can do it, and Riven is going to have a lot harder time in doing this. But yeah, fighters can carry, AD carries can carry, tanks have a hard time carrying, unless you give them really good gold scaling and say, actually, you can become a high damage champion, and if you're far enough ahead, you can be a juggernaut. Or if you want to switch to an alt build because you're far ahead, you can become a juggernaut. I think that's actually fairly compelling, to give tank players the option to become a juggernaut. Or a diver. I think that is reasonable. It's a different topic here at this point, but hey, that is a piece of agency, is can you carry the game if you're ahead? And generally speaking, a question worth answering is what happens to a champ when they are far ahead? If you're far ahead, do you start killing everybody? If you're far ahead, you just take 10 seconds longer to kill, but the fights are similar if they don't have to hit you first? Are you able to duel? What happens in side lane? And, a question to answer, but hey, this is one way to think about champion agency. The second one is kit versatility. Talked about it a little bit before. Talk about it here. And this really strongly scales with player skill. This is your kit's ability to react to what your opponents are doing, right? This is your champion's ability indexed through your player skill to outplay your opponents. And to answer the question, who's balanced around, I think we should be balancing around, as mentioned up here, players are highly proficient, which means the expected result here is champs with high kit versatility are going to be the most prevalent in Challenger and Pro play. K'Sante is the most versatile tank. Now, maybe he shouldn't be a highly versatile tank, but he's certainly the highest agency tank because, well, it turns out he can scale, he can carry, he can do stuff when he's far ahead. Malphite doesn't, Sion doesn't really, Ornn doesn't really. He scales, but he scales by reaching level 17 and giving everyone upgraded items at 1,000 gold. That's not hard. That's right-click on a guy and channel for 2 seconds. Scaling is not necessarily agency directly. It's just how much can you use player skill to win the game. K'Sante can use a lot. Ezreal E can learn a lot. Again, Ezreal's kit is straightforward. However, it does scale with player skill. Now, not really champion mastery, but player skill. What percentage of Malphite ults are somewhat parried by Arcane Shift? I'll bet you the percentage goes up in higher elo. I bet you it goes up even higher in really elite skill brackets. Think about the Captain Jack Sivir Spell Shield Cleanse QSS where he gets rid of 4 CCs without dropping a beat. Yeah, 99% of us can't do that. But it turns out Spell Shield is a relatively high agency skill. Turns out Summoner Spell Cleanse, relatively high agency Summoner Spell. Turns out QSS, relatively high agency item. And so those things can all add up and say, well, that's a lot of kit versatility. It's a lot of ways to answer the options here. And your average bronze solo queue player is just going to miss a lot of those. And despite the fact that Sivir is very intuitive to play, and it's not like your 500th game on Sivir, you like understand that Spell Shield is good. It's just, well, how good League of Legends? That's how good Spell Shield is. That's how good Arcane Shift is. Kai'Sa R is this. Kai'Sa has the ability to join into way more fights than other champions can. She has the ability to assassinate backline. That's really cool. That is a really cool way to give her agency and to make her stand out from other AD carries in League of Legends. Her kit is relatively straightforward aside from this spell. And this is where a lot of her agency comes from, is her ability to suddenly come in and be an assassin, to play the other side of the fight when other champions just simply could not do this. A lot of other AD carries cannot outplay Malphite R. Most AD carries cannot suddenly reach backline, but she can. Samira is interesting as a case study because she's gone on both sides before. So when Samira first came out, she was actually a consistent pro play problem because she was an incredibly strong lane bully. If her ally landed any CC, she was able to very easily land a very long range follow-up long duration stun. Her dash and autos did a ton of damage. I remember there's an LCS level 1 that I think I cast, where it's literally level 1, and it's something like Leona Kai'Sa versus like Lulu Aphelios. And what happens is Lulu Aphelios is like, well, we're playing double range and you have Leona. You're useless. We're going to bully you. And so they walk up. I think it's FBI playing Aphelios, and who he maybe back then, I don't remember, whatever. And so Lulu shields Aphelios, so he gets help picks on him, and he starts attacking and dealing damage. And Samira throws out one Q. And the Q pops Guardian. And then the second the Lulu shield and Guardian shield times out, both these players instantly flash forward. I think this is like when it's tactical and core JJ. I think these are the players. And they instantly, and basically like, so it's like blue team bot lane is Lulu Aphelios and red team bot lane is the Samira Leona or whatever. And so blue team is pushed all the way up into the third brush, right? They're like all the way up to red team's third brush in bot lane. And at level 1 with no minion wave and like the ignite and the Leona stun get like instantly cleansed, Samira just walks him down and solo kills the Aphelios. Solo kills, obviously the support's interacting here, but it's like she had so much kill threat off of using the knockup to combo off of her support and so much damage via the sword and attack speed via the E that Samira had an absurdly high amount of laning phase agency, that her kit was so strong that when you were playing it right, you had incredibly high damage uptime and could run somebody down through the entire lane at level 1 with an enchanter next to this guy. That was how much agency she had over the laning phase, that she had the ability to completely kill you down a long lane at level 1 with a little bit of support from her support here. Now, as time has gone on, Samira's had a much worse laning phase. She can have some kill threat. It is there, but it requires people to be lower and lower before it really happens. She no longer has the ability to just run you down with just a Doran's Blade over the course of a long lane. That is no longer true about Samira anymore. The rest of Samira's damage, outside of that, generally speaking, comes from her R. She has okay-ish steroids. She has like some decent stuff. You're right. She has her W to parry some damage. Like, I don't want to say that Samira is low agency, but as you start playing late game Samira, it's okay, am I good enough to get my combo out and then play for my R? And that is a lot of damage. But that kit has a lot of enemy counterplay. If Janna is paying attention and Samira starts R, Janna presses R back, she gets one bullet out and her ultimate's gone. And she's got to try to rebuild the entire combo with W and E both on cooldown. Good luck with that one. And so this, of course, depends on how skilled her opponents are. But we have had versions of Samira where she had ultimate agency levels 1 through 3 because she could just kill you. We're in a version now where Samira doesn't have as much agency because, yes, she still has wind wall. She has some laning phase threat. I'm not saying she's low agency, but she's no longer the best early game AD carry in terms of kill threat. And her R has a lot of room for opponents to outplay her. Zeri, a final example here, we're talking about a bunch of AD carries here, but Zeri has a ton of agency. E can escape every single gank forever. R is infinite duration bonus move speed on an AD carry. She can react to basically everything. She has like all of the control. Zeri, Zeri with a kit like this, which I don't think is going to go away anytime soon, or ever, is always going to be a very, very high agency AD carry from a kit versatility perspective, as well as a scaling and carryability perspective, because all Zeri can do is convert gold into damage. She doesn't really do anything else aside from be self-sufficient and very high damage and convert gold into stuff. So Zeri is arguably the highest agency AD carry in League of Legends. The final point around agency is counterplay. How much does that matter that you're good at League of Legends, that you know your champion, that you're during your power curve, that you're ahead in gold, that whatever. There's a lot of things that matter here. One, are your outputs targeted? Because if they're targeted versus skill shots, your opponents can outplay skill shots. They cannot outplay right clicks. There's a reason AD carries are very, very high agency. Yes, they can be killed by assassins. That's got to remain up because you can't outplay them in combat. You have to outplay them on the strategic layer, basically, because you will have a very hard time outplaying them on a tactical layer, especially if these champions have peel, especially if they have abilities like Samira W and Zeri E and Zeri R and Vayne E and Vayne RQ and whatnot. It's like there's a lot of abilities here. Ezreal E as well. Part of the only reason Ezreal's allowed to have this much range with his Q and this much safety with his E is because he's actually a fairly low damage champion late game. Most other AD carries outscale him. So even though Ezreal has a lot of kit versatility, he doesn't have the same targeted outputs power or just straight up carryability here. And so this means that his agency, you could kind of fluctuate in a lot of ways. He scores really, really high here. He scales relatively lowly here. And certainly his Qs are not exactly easy to dodge, but at least dodgeable. The W and R are at least dodgeable. And actually, some of the changes we've made to Ezreal fairly recently were actually playing up his W and his R damage. His auto attacks are the most elite skewed part of his kit. His W and R are the most low elo skewed parts of his kit. And so as a champion who is natively going to be somewhat elite skewed by being vaguely high agency through the counterplay lens, by putting his damage into higher counterplay areas, we are allowed to somewhat flatten out this champion's not mastery curve, but agency, win rate by MMR curve by saying, well, actually, a decent portion of your damage is actually going to be locked away into low agency areas in order to balance out the fact that your defenses are so high agency, that he has a really good laning phase, actually. He's got a lot of control over how this goes. The counterplay to Ezreal in early lane is pretty low, actually. So, again, targeted outputs versus skill shots. Cleanses can do this, right? You can cleanse CC. Sorry, you can't stun me. This is actually why Malzahar can be really, really good in certain team compositions, because it is hard to cleanse his ultimate. Obviously, QSS exists, sure, but you can't dodge it, right? Malzahar is targeted and can't be cleansed without buying QSS. Hey, he has a target output that removes one of the types of defenses. Malzahar can be really, really good and extremely high MMR. I mean, Malzahar won a world championship back in 2017, sorry. Yeah, that's the one. No, wait. Oh my gosh. It was 2017. I know it was. Anyway. Oh my gosh, I'm blinking. I'm pretty sure it was. Wow, I cast this one. And now I'm like, it's a 16 or 17. Moving on. Parries are a really big deal, all right? A parry says that, hey, here's a shortly timed defensive window that if I can use it correctly, I'm going to get something really, really valuable here. Fiora is, high agency through counterplay. It's like, well, I can just parry your thing. And so how easy is it to parry it? How easy is it to get rid of this? Like if you're trying to kill me, but I can always parry your big skill. Hey, what does, let's say, Yasuo versus Veigar look like? Well, if he's not stunned, what is the counterplay to, let's say, Veigar R? Oh, Yasuo can just always parry this. Fiora can always parry this. Master Yi can parry this by literally dodging it with Q, pressing W or whatever. So hey, Veigar has a lot of counterplay on his abilities, right? They're really telegraphed. The skill shots on Q, W, and E are all very telegraphed and can be outplayed. Veigar has a lot of counterplay. Veigar is unsurprisingly not very good in high elos because he has a lot of counterplay. The last two, though, I think are really important, though. And this is actually why I think we're seeing so many ranged auto attackers in specifically high elo solo queue, despite very low win rates. These are very safe champions who can outplay getting ganked, right? There's no counterplay to Tristana being a lane bully or Lucian being a lane bully if they can always dash away from the jungler. And what do you do when you're a melee ranged top laner laning up against Twisted Fate or Vayne or whatever? They outrange you. And one thing to think about here is, let's just do some quick napkin math on health regen and last hitting and gold income. Theoretically, nothing should stop you from auto-attacking the top laner every single time they last hit any single minion. If you're Vayne or Teemo or Quinn or TF or Kennen, every single time they last hit, they should take a right click. The only thing really stopping you is your skill level. Also, you should be able to get every single last hit ever in the lane. You should be able to get 12 CS per minute. The only thing stopping you is your skill level, because you outrange them. In a lot of these cases, they can't even reach you because you have a parry or a dash or a cleanse or something, and all your damage is targeted. How exactly does TF, who has gold card in reserve at all times, ever lose to any melee champion? He outranges them, he outsustains them, he keeps them at distance, and if you ever try to do something, sorry, he has a targeted hard CC to get back away. It's functionally a parry here. And this is why we'll see win rates be fairly low in these champions, despite the fact that they are clearly amazing, because there is no counterplay to these champions when played properly. And we have to, pick the skill level that we balance them around, but, us mortals don't, poke somebody every single time they ever go for a last hit, right? But you think about regen, and a good baseline regen for melee champion is about 2 health per second. And if they're taking 40-ish damage after armor for every last hit they take, and a minion spawns every 5 seconds, well, they're taking 40 damage every 5 seconds, they're regenning 10 health every 5 seconds, this math is off. And that's not counting any offensive spells used to increase the damage even further. Functionally, unsurprisingly, every ranged melee matchup is incredibly high value for the ranged champion, unless they don't have the way to continue to use the range advantage. If Renekton can always use double dash, or Riven can always use EQQQ to always close the gap, not get parried or dashed away from, and get in there, and then have her own reliable damage output, then suddenly you can flip the matchup around. But if you don't have the tools, there is no counterplay for the ranged champion in that lane. But that only matters when these actually get used appropriately. If, as the melee champion, you are not getting punished for every CS, that champ is not using its agency properly, and if we're balancing it around, you actually being good at the champion and being proficient at the champion, well, you're just not going to see high win rates on these champions who are normally able to bully you and normally able to use these incredibly low counterplay targeted outputs at range. So, a couple minor things. Let's add some addenda here as we're going on to an hour into this video, because of course we are. This is basically from the 7-5 team. So from the perspective of someone who works on someone's team and is then implicitly a ranked perspective, right? This is explicitly for like, hey, here's things to think about for a fairly highly engaged, competitive, ranked audience. These are not the things that are going to matter for all games or even all game modes in League of Legends by any means, but my job is largely around the ranked Summoner's Rift experience on League of Legends, so this is generally what the content is going to be and the lens through which I'm talking about this one. And to be clear, competitiveness is more than just pro play. Yes, we could absolutely tune champions with just like Faker and Chovy and Pays in mind. That would make the game much worse for everyone else here. And so ultimately, we want the game to be competitive for everyone. We want the mastery journey to be available for everyone. Mastery starts the second you start playing a game and you unlock and you start learning what all the mechanics are and what are the optimizations you can make. And it's meant to never end. There's meant to always be more things to learn and more things to master. And so a way to feed into that is to make sure a game is balanced and well-tuned and such that the game is not just over because of the champion you chose or the matchup you're in or whatever. Addendum 2 is around player sentiment. Ultimately, even if these things were possible to be mathematically quantified and perfectly balanced, what matters more is the experience of the human beings playing the game. If no one thinks a champ is good, that's a problem, even if mathematically the champ is totally fine and completely reasonable and actually powerful enough. Modern day Skarner is actually, as far as we can tell from mastery data, completely fine. Just have to get good at the champion. But Champion's relatively new, came out, March-ish this year, and, not that many mains yet. And so the win rate's fairly low because a lot of people are at the very bottom mastery curve. And he's actually relatively hard. And so, if no one believes Champion's viable, they're not going to play him, and we never get the mains who drag up the win rate and show players the champ is viable. Players ultimately interact with the game as it's getting played, and if they never run into a main, they never run into a high-performing version of the champion, it will always look like a bad champion. And then, well, why would you play it? It always looks bad. People believing a champion is overpowered is a problem. Even if the champion is appropriately tuned, if everyone thinks a champ is OP, well, that's a problem. That thing has to be fixed, right? Another thing, though, is that game-to-game variance is a good outcome. That this is a reason why you may, among these other two, why you may choose to tune champions beyond what a mathematically balanced mastery and agency framework would give you. Because yeah, they're theoretically balanced, but no one thinks they're good. They're not good. If they're mathematically balanced, but everyone thinks they're OP, they're OP as far as your players are concerned. That's all that really matters, is that they don't think the game is competitive. They don't think they have a fair shot at winning because they believe the champ is overpowered. And just a general, decent, viable, good thing is to have some game-to-game variance, which means, yeah, maybe you take 0.2% off of the most popular champion's win rate and you donate it because they're 5 times as popular as plus 1% win rate to the low popularity champions. And Kog'Maw is allowed to be 1% OP because no one plays him anyway. And so getting to see Kog'Maw once in a while is not going to be that frustrating because you're not running to a Kog'Maw who runs you over. Honestly, that champ is fairly low agency anyway, so you don't tend to mind the fact that win rate's very high. But also the fact that if ever the champion is losing win rate due to not accessing their agency, and Kog'Maw has none, then Kog'Maw would indirectly just have a inflated win rate from an agency metric, even if you couldn't quantify it. And you said, well, wave our hands and slightly lower the win rate of high agency champions, slightly raise the win rate of low agency champions, you would give win rate to Kog'Maw, and players would feel fine about it because they know they could outplay him, and as they're playing competing AD carry, they know that they could outplay things that Kog'Maw couldn't, and this seems to be true, right? This is all still based on how players actually feel about the game, and these are ways to essentially add like definitions or rationale for why these phenomena tend to exist, that win rates do not match player perception. I think these are, again, 2 good front runners. Addendum 3, objectivity versus design instinct. So again, you could objectively measure, you could try at least, champion mastery and champion difficulty and agency and maybe some other things as well, and have a like theoretically perfectly balanced design game, but that's not the most important thing. Like, it is important that a game is balanced. It is not crucial the game is perfectly balanced. That doesn't actually really matter. You just want a game that is competitive to feel balanced, and that is always important to have. And even if you had a objectively perfectly balanced game, you still need design instinct. You still need to say, well, that's nice that the data tells me something, but the goal is to be data informed, even if I have some objective answers here. But design instinct matters, and so it's really important to be able to base your thoughts, your changes, your ideas in something sort of remotely measurable, to at least have that there's something to point to. But the value of having a mix of both is that this helps you not be biased. That, if you believe that Rammus is supposed to be 53% win rate because he, counters a bunch of attack damage champions, and you do the math, you get the data, and you say, well, actually, Rammus is only 1% win rate inflated from counter matchups, and he's actually really difficult because Rammus has really unintuitive skill, press like combos and whatnot. So actually, Rammus is high mastery, and he has very low mains, and he's not actually very heavily win rate inflated because of champion matchups. Then, actually, objectively, Rammus's correct win rate is like maybe 50.5. Again, made up numbers. I don't know what it actually is here, but like getting a point to the side and say, actually, the math says Rammus should be 50.5. Are we sure we want him at 53 or 54? And you can make the call that yes. You can make the call that intentionally sharp counter champions should be overtuned, that they are always a good option, even if you're bad at them, when the game calls for it. That is a call you could make, and that would be defensible. If that serves your goals, right? If that serves other goals that are important. If it was important to League of Legends that countering in champ select was a commonly tested skill with a lot of value, you could ensure that hard counter champions like Rammus and Malphite were tuned aggressively strong, such that if the champ select ever called for an armor stacker, it was always going to be a good option there. Okay, if that was something that was considered valuable, then there you go. That is something you could do and tune to serve that goal. If it was important to you that, AD carries were made to be lower agency, you could find ways to tune AD carries to have less agency in their kits, but, give them something else that's lower agency, like who knows what, health regen or something. Those are all things that you could do to serve a game as a whole overall. That covers the thing. Managed to make it under an hour. I basically went over estimate by about 3 times as much because I spent that much time. Hopefully you enjoyed this, though. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.